Billie, just to help us make sure we've got the mics and the sound right, tell us where you travelled down from today.
Okay, travelled down from Ormskirk, just north of Liverpool.
And that's not an Ormskirk accent, is it?
Oh no, this is not a Lancashire accent. It's Northern Ireland.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about whereabouts in Northern Ireland you grew up and what it was like growing up for you. Sorry, can I just check you guys are okay? You can hear at the back. Brilliant. Yeah, tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, family life, that kind of thing.
Yeah, grew up in East Belfast. So if you see any footage from Belfast, you see the two Harlan and Wolff cranes, the big yellow cranes. Grew up in the shadow of those cranes. I remember the first one being built in 68, 69. But yeah, that's a part of the city I came from. Very happy, very loving family environment. Mum, dad, older sister, older brother, myself, and then a younger sister. And as I say, growing up in the 60s, very safe, very secure. And my sister, she loved the Beatles and the Monkees, those of you who are old enough to remember that. And my brother, he loved the Rolling Stones and everything Motown. And my mum, when she went around the house cleaning, she would be singing country songs. So I've got a bit of an...
Do you want to sing one for us now?
Yeah, we'd clear the building. Hey.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, I'd have bit of an eclectic sort of mix of music there. But yeah, growing up in the 60s, you know, what captured my imagination as a young boy was the Apollo space program, you know, sending somebody to the moon. That's what grabbed my imagination as a kid.
Did you watch that live in 69? It was 69, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you know, following this whole program, and that's what grabbed my imagination more than anything that was unfolding in the streets of Belfast and Londonderry in the late 60s, as the Troubles began to take hold in the province.
Were you aware that there was something serious going on in the streets?
I was aware that something was going on. How serious it was, I didn't know. But it didn't cause me any degree of angst, because I think my family, mum and dad, tried to protect us from what was obviously growing and becoming more serious. So yeah, when the British troops landed on the streets in 1969, that was a novelty more than anything that causes any degree of fear or apprehension. Seeing, you know, the troops with their armoured personnel carriers, the barbed wire, the guns, etc. It was more of a novelty than anything that was unduly frightening.
But obviously, as time went by, the local community was affected more and more, even your family as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. On Saturday the 27th of June 1970, it was a glorious, you know, summer's day. I'd got up that morning and went to on a walk with my dad to the local park, spent all that morning with him.
How old were you at this time?
12. In the first part of the afternoon. It's a day that holds so many precious memories for myself, and yet at the same time, at the end of that night, as my dad was coming home from a social club, IRA gunmen opened up as he turned the corner, and he was shot dead. It was about 11:30 at night. I was out in the street playing, waiting on my dad coming home, and I heard that blast of automatic gunfire. Little did I know it was my dad being killed. He wasn't the first civilian to be killed. He was among one of the first civilians to be killed in the Troubles. And the gunfire continued right throughout the whole night. It didn't stop. Several hours of constant shooting. And yeah, that was 27th of June 1970.
I can't imagine what that must have been like to face as a 12-year-old boy. How did you try to make sense of that?
Well, it's difficult to make sense of, you know, that level of violence, and making sense of, you know, your dad being brought home in a coffin. I remember when I was told about his death, I was pulled into a neighbour's house. Shooting was continuing. I was sitting in the living room of my neighbour's house. I had my eyes closed. There were a number of adults who had also run into the house when the shooting started. And there were people coming and going. I was sitting with my eyes closed and I could hear hushed whispers. It's awful, it's terrible, it's shocking. Does he know? Has anybody told him? And I remember getting up saying, "What haven't you told me?" and running out the door and started to run up the street. But it was bringing me into line with a gunfire. And my friend's dad stepped out and grabbed me. And I must have been crying. I was saying, "Where's my daddy? Where's my daddy?" I must have sensed that something was wrong. And he said, "Billy, your daddy's not coming home, your daddy's dead." And I remember saying to him, perhaps it was God's will. And he grabbed me by the shoulders, and he nearly shook the life out of me. And he used an expletive saying there was no God. And it was those, referring to the Roman Catholic community across the road, he said it was those, they killed your dad, don't you forget that. And I guess, from that moment on, I didn't forget it in the sense that, God really became irrelevant after that. As a young boy, I was sent to Sunday school like most kids were in the area. But after my dad was killed, God became irrelevant. And seeing what had taken place, the hate and the bitterness that entered my life and my family's life. My family don't have a monopoly on violence, obviously. There have been so many families touched as a result of the madness that emanated from Ireland during now 3 decades of violence. And not everybody reacted the way my family reacted, but my family reacted with hate and bitterness. And there was an insatiable longing for revenge.
Do you mind telling us how that began to play out in your family and in yourself, and where that took you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you hear a lot today about radicalisation and what radicalises people. Seeing your dad brought home in a coffin, and certainly radicalises and fuels radicalisation. The day of my dad's funeral, standing as a young boy with my uncle beside me holding my hand, and my mum, her screams as they were bringing my dad's coffin out of the house, and they had to pry her fingers off the casket, and she was screaming, "Don't take my husband, don't take my husband." And you want to know what fuels radicalisation? That buzzword wasn't in vogue back then, but certainly the concept was. And you say, "I'm going to get revenge." My mum was 3 months pregnant at the time my dad was killed. 6 months later, the day my kid brother's born. And I can still remember him as a wee boy, wee toddler, running in off the street, running up to my mum and asking what a daddy was. How come his friends had a daddy to talk about and he hadn't? And to see my mum, break down in tears, trying to explain why. Boy, the use of the buzzword, the radicalisation, it grows. And the cancerous hate, just becomes more and more dark, more and more enveloping. And I'm not saying that what I related to you justifies my actions and the road that I took. I'm just trying to explain to you how I felt at the time. But at the age of 16, I went out of my way to join a loyalist paramilitary organisation. As far as I was concerned, they were a means to an end. They would have afforded me the opportunity to get the revenge that I was longing for. I remember the night that I joined, the organisation went into a bar room, and there were about 60 or so young lads sitting in this bar. Just went through the door of the bar, and the commander of this little unit came up to us, introduced himself. He said, "What do you want to do?" And the 3 of us who joined that night, I and the other 2, I said, "The only thing I want to do is kill." and he laughed and made a gesture with his hand, to the 60 odd guys behind him. He says, there's 60 or so in front of you, you have to wait your turn. And that's what I found frustrating, that I was in a queue, that I would have to wait my turn before I could get my revenge. But I went into that organisation with the intent of killing.
Do you want to tell us how that played out as time, as you went through the queue?
Yeah. Well, I was approached initially in October '75 and asked if I would take part in the shooting of a Republican, which I readily agreed to. And that shooting was called off. And then in February '76, I was approached again and told that the shooting was back on again. Was I still prepared to take part in it? I said, yeah. And then I said, well, there's just a little qualifier. It's not a Republican, it's not an IRA man, he's actually one of our own. He's a fellow UVF man. We believe he's an informer, and the rules of the organisation, if you inform the police, it's an immediate death sentence. But they said, because he's not a Republican, because he's one of our own, we understand you might want to do the shooting, so you can back out if you want. But I thought if I had it backed out, they would have said, he's all talk. When push comes to shove, he bottles it. But as I say, people in the organisation knew the rules. If you were an informer, then it was a death sentence. So I agreed to do this shooting, and on the 19th of February 1976, along with an accomplice, I left the house that morning, went and picked up a couple of guns and laid in wait in a derelict street for our victim to turn up. And about 7:15, we stepped out of a derelict house into this derelict street and executed this man in cold blood. It was cold, it was callous, it was bloody, it was brutal. There was no twinge of conscience, there was no there was no sense of regret or remorse or anything. It was just this feeling that now I have proven myself and I'm just going to go on a killing spree. We were clean away. I don't think the police turned up until about 20 minutes after the shooting. And by that time I was in Harland and Wolff shipyard, clocked on and clean away as far as I was concerned. Obviously God sees, but humanly speaking, I thought we were well away.
But eventually those crimes caught up with you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, it was 2 weeks later, 8th of March '76, I was arrested. I thought I was being arrested for hijackings. We were taking part in hijackings and things over the previous weekend, and I, foolishly had put a dummy bomb into a hijacked wagon with no gloves on, so I thought the police had just, fingerprinted this dummy bomb and got my fingerprints, and that's what they were arresting me for. So I had my whole story concocted around this hijacking and how my fingerprints ended up on a dummy bomb. But the police came in through their file down on the table in the interrogation room and began to tell me practically everything that took place on the 19th of February '76. Got a few things wrong, but basically, I'm saying, how do you know that?
How did they know?
Yeah, somebody informed on us. Apparently, that's what came out in their trial. The police arrested us due to information received. So yeah, I was arrested, charged with the murder on the 19th of February '76. Found myself in the Maze prison.
Do you want to, if I ask at this point, obviously you've spoken about how so much of this was driven by hate and bitterness. Where were you at in terms of hate and bitterness as you find yourself in the Maze prison?
Oh, right. No, the hate's still there, it's still growing, it's still being fed.
No regrets?
no regrets. In fact, when you went to prison, there was no stigma attached to it. There was a level of support within the community. And went into the Maze prison, held in a part of the prison that solely held members of the organisation that I was affiliated with. It was run along military lines, and that's where I spent the next 14 months or so until I was sentenced in May 1977. I was too young to be given a life sentence. I was sentenced to be detained under the Secretary of State's pleasure. But it's the same as a life sentence, just takes longer to say it. And and the judge found us guilty. We did arrogantly, defiantly laughed in the judge's face. Such was my contempt of man's justice.
And so that was the posture, that was your attitude when you went in. But that wasn't how you came out.
No.
Do you want to tell us about what happened whilst you were...
See, looking back, Steve, there were sort of maybe three things very quickly. I'll try and keep an eye on the clock because I know you've got to give the word.
I think we want to hear from you, so don't rush it. This is important.
Yeah, it's okay, Steve. Three things looking back. After I was sentenced, transferred to the H blocks of the Maze prison. Those of you who are sort of familiar with the 30 Years of Troubles, out of the H blocks come the Republican protests, starting with the blanket protests, where the prisoners sat naked in their cells with just a blanket wrapped around them. The blanket protests then escalated to the dirty protests, where they smeared their excrement around the prison wall, and then eventually the hunger strike. All of that comes from the H blocks. Now, when I was transferred to the H blocks, it was only there a matter of weeks when another prisoner arrived who I was on remand with, Peter Thompson. And Peter came to the H blocks carrying a Bible. Now, when I left him back in the remand part of the prison, he wasn't carrying a Bible, he wasn't talking about Jesus, but here he was now talking about Jesus and carrying a Bible after he had been sentenced, which I thought was pretty convenient because he's just been given a life sentence. He wants to get out of prison early. How is he going to get out of prison early? Well, he has to show the authorities that he's a changed character, that he's now a good guy. And instead of carrying a bomb, he's carrying a Bible, and he's talking about Jesus. Now, as far as I was concerned, he was a hypocrite. He was a phony. He couldn't just face up to the pressures of the penal system, and, Christianity was a convenient crutch. But he designated himself a block barber. So if you needed a haircut, you had to send for Peter. And he had a really novel way of sharing his faith. You would get in a chair and he would start cutting your hair, and then he would put the scissors on the side of your neck, and he would apply some pressure to it, like.
I've been missing that trick when I've been preaching myself.
Yeah. and he would
works. Wow.
He would be saying, right, just another little bit of pressure, and I'm into your jugular. And you're down here in a pool of blood, and by the time they get a medic down here to stem the flow of the blood, you're dead. And because you're not a Christian, you're going straight to hell. Now, see, are there any hairdressers here tonight? You can try that with your clients tomorrow. But that was Peter's approach to sharing his faith. And you're thinking, I only want a haircut, and I've no time for God, I've no time for religion. And Peter's sort of given all this spiel about Jesus. And it was around about 1978, the second thing that happened, and this is bizarre, but this is how it happened. Started to receive magazines from New Zealand. I only ever opened one of these. It was in a long sort of brown envelope, handwritten address to myself in H Block 7 of the Maze prison. New Zealand stamp, New Zealand postmark. Now to this day I do not know anybody in New Zealand. But I pull the contents out of this envelope, catch the name of Jesus somewhere in the corner, put it back in the envelope, curl it up in the ball and throw it in the waste paper bin. 6 or 8 weeks later, another one of these magazines. Postmark, New Zealand stamp, New Zealand, the same distinctive handwriting, goes into the bin, no time for it. These magazines keep coming. Peter Thompson still running about the prison, cutting people's hair with his novel approach to evangelism. And I thought, well, Peter, could be making use of this stuff because he's into this, religious carry on. And so I started to defer the magazines to him. As soon as the prison officer gave them to myself, I would say, look, give that to Peter Thompson, he's into this nonsense. So that's the second thing, right? These sort of magazines that have been coming, and I'm giving them to Peter Thompson now. In 1980, I went out to the medical room for headache tablets one Thursday night. It was August 80. I had a terrible migraine headache, and I went into the medical room, and Peter Thompson's in the medical room, and I just said to him, Peter, I hope you're getting these magazines that I'm sending over to you. I don't know who's sending them, but you're quite welcome to them. And even before Peter could answer, the medical officer became a good friend, a guy called Joe Martin. He said, do you not think it's God sending you these magazines? I've never heard anything as ridiculous in my life. God sending magazines from New Zealand to them in his prison. And usually when Christians said to me that, talked about God, I said I didn't believe that God existed. And that's what I said to this medical officer this night. I don't believe in God. I don't believe he exists. And he said to me, regardless of whether I believed in God or not, didn't take away the fact that there was a God. Nor did it take away the fact that if there was a heaven and a hell, I was going to hell. And the tragedy of it was that once I was there, I would be a believer, because nobody in hell disbelieves. And once you're there forever. Now, I couldn't sort of hit him with a line of argument for you're a fool, because that's normally what a Christian said to me when I said there was no God, you're a fool. And I wasn't expecting that answer, so I turned and I hightailed it out of that medical room. And as I thought about it, there was a heaven and a hell. Yeah, no argument, like I know where I'm going, but is there a heaven, is there a hell? Is there a God? Where was this great God of love, mercy, this all-powerful God the night my dad was killed? If there is a God, he's probably just wound this universe up and walked off and left us to get on with it, if there is a God. But is there a God? And I guess after that little conversation with Joe Martin, I started to ask a number of questions of Christian prisoners and prison officers. And I say, this is the bizarre bit, what I can't give an adequate explanation for in relation to these magazines, and I never read one of them. After that conversation with Joe Martin in the medical room, I never received another one of them. It's as freaky as that, but that's just how it happened. On Christmas Eve 1980, there was a prison officer on the front gate of the H block, it was H block 7, prison sort of worker was coming in, a woman called Gladys Blackburn. She was a member of the Board of Visitors, people that you're drawn from civilian society that can go into the prison, make sure it's run along humane lines. Gladys was one of these Board of Visitors. And Gladys came down to my cell, and after a bit of formal conversation, she just simply lifted down the Bible and started to read the story of the crucifixion from Luke chapter 23, where Jesus is crucified on the cross, 2 thieves either side of him. And one of the thieves, the two of them initially are abusing Jesus and shouting abuse at him. And then one of them says, we deserve what we are getting. We're guilty, but this man's innocent, referring to Jesus. And he said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And she stopped at that 42nd verse of Luke 23, and she said, think who this thief's calling Lord. And she described what Jesus must have looked like on the cross. And as she was describing what Jesus looked like, with these, the spittle and the beard trailed up his face, and he's punched, they've stripped him naked to humiliate him, and his back has been lacerated with a Roman whip. As she's explaining all of this, I realised the truth of what the thief had said. This man's innocent. Jesus was innocent. In contrast, I was guilty, and I felt that overwhelming sense of guilt. You know, before that, if you'd have met me in prison and said, you know, were you guilty, were you justified in what you were doing, I would have protested my innocence tenaciously, and in a warped way would have tried to justify my actions to you. But that night when we came face to face with the cross of Christ, like, there was no justification. You know, I was guilty. Yeah, I had laughed in Belfast High Court and treated man's justice with contempt, but boy, when I came face to face with God's justice, there was no laughing. Realised the truth of what Joe Martin said: if I had died in the state I was in, I was going to hell, and justly so. And not only had I offended my fellow man, but I had offended God. And I realised that Jesus Christ was sinless, and as I say, in contrast to me, you know, my life was characterised by all manner of evil and everything repugnant. And yet on the cross, and this is where the realisation of what was happening on the cross came in, I realised, and it's only God, I guess, could open your heart to this and your eyes to this, I realised that Jesus Christ, he who knew no sin, was on that cross because he was bearing my sin. And that, you know, was just so real to me that night. That's why Jesus Christ came into the world, to die for sinners like me. And I turned and I asked that woman, how do you become a Christian? She said, I'll explain it as simply as ABC. Accept Jesus Christ died for you, believe it, and then you go out and confess it to others. Accept it and believe it, yeah. Confess it to others. That's a sticking point, because I knew what I thought about Peter Thompson. And if I became a Christian, I knew what everybody would think of me. So nah, I don't, time's hard enough without sort of setting you up for that type of abuse. But she left me with a number of portions of Scripture, one of them being John 6:37. All that the Father give to me will come to me, and he who comes to me I will never turn away. And that night, Christmas Eve 1980, I got down on my knees in a cell, aged block 7 of the Maze prison. I repented of my sin, asked God to come into my life and make something of this wasted life. Now, there's no claps of thunder, funny mystical experience, you know, there was no flashes of lightning. It was just a simple prayer of faith, and God heard that. And my life was transformed, you know, that Christmas Eve night. It was, as I say, it was a simple prayer of faith, you know, cried out unto God. And the confessing the faith to others, like, the way I got round that, this isn't PC, but the guy who was in the next cell to me, a guy called Michael McGee, we called him Shirley, and this is no offence to the ladies here. We called him Shirley because he was a gossip. You know, these women, these are always gossiping, like. And he was a gossip. So see whatever you told Shirley, as we called him, he would tell everybody else. He would just gossip it. So when the prison officer opened my cell on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, I followed him as he opened up Shirley McGee's cell, and I shouted, I became a Christian last night. And true to form, Shirley followed Big Cheesy down the wing as he was opening every cell and said, do you know what he's done? So he told everybody for me. Now, I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but that's the way I ended up sort of confessing my faith, you know. But, you know, I thought, as I said, you know, Peter Thompson needed a crutch to lean on. Why? You know, God's not in the business of giving out crutches. I could say he gave me a new pair of legs whereby I could stand for myself, but that would be shortchanging it, wouldn't it? God gave me a brand new life. You know, he said, as Jesus said to Nicodemus, you must be born again. And that's what he gave me, a brand new life. You know, that's what's on offer. A new life to start with. And that's what God gave me that night.
That seems quite at odds with the sort of the common view of religion, which is you do something good for God, and if he is there, he'll sprinkle fairy dust on your life, or he owes you in some regards. But it seems to me that what the story you've told totally upends that, because you had nothing to be able to bring to him, just like those thieves on the cross.
Yeah.
There was nothing that they could bring. They couldn't put a case to say, here's why you should be kind and gracious to me.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that and how that impacts you and the way you think about your hope in Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't bring anything to God. Obviously, my life was characterised by all sorts of manner of evil. I didn't go into any of the gory details, obviously, about my past, because it doesn't bring glory to God. But I couldn't bring a good life or a decent life to God and say, you owe me, because there was nothing good about my life, nothing commendable. And so we use the word in Christianity called grace, undeserved favour, and that's what God gave me that night. He gave me something that I did not deserve. I deserved judgment. That's what Christ got. Christ took that judgment. Christ got what he didn't deserve. My judgment, and I got what I didn't deserve, his righteousness. Because that's what was imputed to me, if we could use that phrase. And and just in relation to what God does when you realise what he has picked you up from, you want to share that, obviously. And I wrote out to family and friends and told them about this tremendous change that had come into my life. And I think it was around about, it was a couple of weeks after we saved, I got a letter from my mum, and the prison authorities weren't going to give me the letter because every letter is censored, and they thought, boy, if he reads this, he's going to go ballistic. But then the prison officer who gave it to me said, look, your mum needs an awful lot of prayer. And when I was reading the letter, I understood why he said that, because in the letter my mum was asking, how could I write out and talk to her about a great God of love, a great God of forgiveness? Where was this all-powerful God of love the night your dad was gunned down in the street like a dog by those IRA scummen? She'd underlined it 3 times. I've still got this letter today. And how she related in the letter, how she met my dad after he came out of the forces in the Second World War, how they got married, all their hopes and their dreams for the future, and then it was all shattered because of what happened that Saturday night. Where was this great God of love? And I must have been reading through Romans, when those are early.
The section of the Bible.
Yeah, that section of the Bible. It says in Romans 12:19, it says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. And I sat down that night and wrote a letter based on Romans 12:19, explaining that we thought vengeance belonged to us, vengeance belongs to God. That was part of my problem, part of my family's problem. Wrote a covering letter out to my sister saying, look, get down to my mum, take her to church with you. She was professing faith at this time, which she did. And letters come back and forward on a regular basis, but I think it was a few weeks after that I got a letter from my mum, and I've still got this letter also. And this is how she opened it. I now know what you mean about God's forgiveness. Tonight at church I became a Christian. And the 2 letters are as different as black as the white. One full of hate, anger and resentment, and the other one where, boy, this mountain of hate has been lifted, and she's saying, I now know. And, after my dad was killed, I said earlier about my mum going around the house when I was a little boy cleaning and singing. And after my dad was murdered, she stopped singing. She said she had nothing to sing about. And that's how it was for 10 years. Her life was so dark, and she didn't sing. But after she became a Christian, she started singing again, because God puts the song back in to the broken life, and he starts to put the broken life, the empty life, back together again. I was back in Northern Ireland 2 weeks ago doing a couple of missions similar to this. Stayed with my mum, she's 94, and she's still singing God's praise. God, this is the God that the Creator God that we believe in, the God who gives the Scriptures, the God who loves us so much that he gave his Son, Jesus Christ, to come into the world to die for us, and opens his arms to welcome us, and wants us to have life, and have it more abundantly.
Just because our time is short, you obviously went in, and our theme tonight is talking about regret. You went into prison with no regret, but obviously you've had an experience of the love of God in your life that has changed the way that you've seen and relate to your past. Can you tell us something about that right now?
Yeah. Yeah, just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean that the consequences of my past actions have been, sort of rubbed out of my mind or anything. There are still consequences to what I had done. And I live with the consequences of that. And one of the consequences obviously is the deep regret, sense of shame and remorse, that I ever took up the gun before I took up the Bible. Living with the fact that I've taken the life of another human being, someone who was created in the image of God. And yet I thought that I had the right to go out and take that life that God had given. And it's the proverbial statement, you wish you could turn the clock back, but believe me friends, I wish I could turn the clock back. There is not a day goes past that I don't live with the regret of my actions. But that is part of the consequences of a sinful life. God helps us to go through that. I am where I am today by the grace of God, but I do regret, deeply regret, my involvement in terrorism. No good, obviously, from a human perspective, came out of my actions. It creates a cycle of violence, but God in His grace brought good out of it. He changed my life in the Maze prison. So yeah, I will live with the consequences of my actions and those regrets. I realise that God has done a work in my life, and for that I'm thankful.
And in a minute, I want to open this up and talk about the difference between bad regrets and good regrets. And just to hear you talk about that story and just share something of the work of God in your life is a joy. This isn't the first time I've interviewed Billie, but every time I hear the story, I'm deeply blessed. Have you appreciated hearing Billie's story? Brilliant.